Good morning and welcome to our Tryon Palace Live today. My name is Hadley Cheris. I'm the Gardens and Greenhouse Manager here at Tryon Palace. I am also our resident pollinator aficionado / sometimes guru. And so today, as part of National Pollinators Week, we are going to be talking about some of the less attractive features of our pollinators and how to get around those and get to be good friends with them even when they may not be doing your most favorite attribute of actually going out and pollinating your garden. So, without further ado, this is going to be Pretty Is as Pretty Does. All right, so we're going to swap over to our PowerPoint here and make sure that we are all good to go on that. Give us just a moment. Are you seeing it? On this though. Okay, I wasn't sure. There we are. Sorry, pardon with us. Our tech guy is being very, very patient with me this morning. So one of the big things just to kind of quickly cover so that we all are kind of starting at a base understanding is that pollination is the act of transferring pollen grains from the male anther part of the plant, which is this stigma and style portion, or not the stigma and style, the opposite part of this, the stamen that you see here highlighted, to the female stigma and style portion in the ovary of the plant. Most of this is actually done by biotic forces, so that's what our pollinators are super important for. And one of the big reasons that plants use pollination is that they're trying to avoid a genetic bottleneck. So by having other creatures and both wind and rain also be a little bit of it, they actually are able to kind of modify this. As humans, as we actually use plant breeding techniques, we further pass along this modification, but most of it is still done by pollinators across the world. This matters because it's 80% of all flowering plants. That's more than 1,200 crops that feed humankind, and globally, pollinators add $217 billion to the economy. So that's a huge, huge amount that we're getting extra. In the United States, just honeybees are responsible for between $1.2 and $5.4 billion in agricultural productivity. One of the big things that this has come about, and part of why we have things like National Pollinators Week, is that we have pollinator populations that are declining, and this is mostly attributed to a loss both in their feeding and their nesting habitats. So, just to kind of start us off with that, we're going to talk about a little bit of each of these as we go forward. And I'll try and give you kind of a ballpark of what these insects and one or two birds are, and a little bit of what they're going to be looking for both as pollinators and some of the unfortunate, not so nice behaviors they occasionally have. These are mostly going to be specific to Eastern North Carolina and North Carolina as a whole. We do have other insects, birds, and animals, mostly mammals, that pollinate in the more tropical regions of the world, but for us, we're really only going to see kind of a couple different groups. And just to give you an idea, this is a super brief chart. I'm not going to stop on it. We'll have links at the end of the presentation. And that reminds me, if you do have questions, please feel free to leave those in the comment section, and we will make sure to answer those at the end. But this is just kind of a general thing of how different each pollinator is, what they're looking for in different plants. So our first one starting out is hummingbirds. Ruby-throated hummingbirds are really the only ones that breed in North Carolina, so they're going to be the ones you see the most. We do have several other species that stop by, but they don't breed, so they're not going to be here as long during the year. They are not monogamous, ruby-throated hummingbirds, and so because of this and the fact that they are migratory, so they don't have long-term home ranges, we're going to see some things that come as part of that. They're attracted to bright flowers, especially red, tubular flowers, so they're going to kind of have that trumpet neck on them, and they're really looking for nectar rich. So you have to remember they are spending a lot of calories flying, and so they need a lot of calories in that nectar. They don't really smell per se, so they're not going to focus on a flower just because it has a scent. It's also important to note in the 3 that you see here pictured, these are all ruby-throated hummingbirds, but the females do not have ruby throats. So, unfortunately, their obnoxious trait is that they are bullies. Especially the gentlemen of the group tend to be quite obnoxious, and so they actually will attack each other to the point of impaling and sometimes causing severe injuries or death. And so one of the big things to think about if you're dealing with this in your garden is that you want to have a broader range of natural food sources. Native coral honeysuckle, which we also saw earlier this week in the hawk salé, is a really, really great one. It has a ton of blooms, so it's really good forage for them. It also makes their lives a lot easier because they can spread out a little more than what we normally see. This is also part of why you want to space feeders. So if you only have 1 or 2 feeders up and they're like 1.5 feet apart from each other, think of this as there being a limited quantity of pizza and you just invited the whole of your family to eat it, and there's only 3 slices. So of course there's going to be some infighting about it. The less that they can actually see each other between the feeders, the less issues you'll have, because you have to remember this is the males competing both for forage and for mating territory. So one that a lot of people don't think about so much, but one of my kind of favorites, this is moths. We have over 1,200 species in North Carolina. Most pollinate during the nighttime, but the 2 pictured here, the sphinx or hawk or hummingbird moths, you can kind of see by their body shape why they get that name, actually pollinate during the daytime. They have extremely long proboscis, that's their tongue or kind of sucking straw, for lack of a better term. They tend to be attracted to paler flowers. They're also going to be tubular and nectar rich, and because they're pollinating more frequently at night, they're also going to go after fragrantly kind of sweet flowers. So you have to think of this as if you're out at night and you can't see any colors, then you're going to be going for what you can smell. However, some of you may also be meeting these little creatures in their smaller form right now. So these caterpillars of the hummingbird hawk moths are actually the tomato and the tobacco hornworm caterpillars. Generally what you'll see featured here in North Carolina is going to be more the tobacco hornworms. You can tell the difference between these and the other ones based on these little white ridges that they have along their bodies. But regardless, if you have them in your garden, you're probably not going to be super happy, and you may not have even taken the time to wonder if they were a tobacco or a tomato hornworm. So how we deal with this is that you might need to sacrifice a few plants. This is one of those things where we tend to talk about a lot at the palace, that tomatoes are kind of heartbreakers to grow anyways. And so, you know, you may have to let 1 or 2 go so that you can have some hummingbird hawk moths in your life as adults. They also do have other larval host plants. So this is flowering nicotiana or flowering tobacco. Same family, which is part of why they go for it, but it is actually a lovely little perennial, self-seeding, kind of like a 4 o'clock, but better behaved. But they will actually eat that instead, and then you can keep your gardens a little clearer. And if you really have issues with large populations, try to hand pick those off. So most of the chemicals, like we talked about on Tuesday in our hawk salé presentation, if it kills a bug, it's going to kill most bugs. So you want to be careful that you're not going to be using chemicals that may damage other caterpillars you're going to have, even if you are not curious enough to want hummingbird hawk moths in your garden. So one of the kind of all-stars, by far the gorgeous girl of the group, so this is butterflies. We have 174 species in North Carolina. Our most common are going to be the swallowtails, which you see a lot of different varieties of. We've seen a lot of those already this year. Sulfur butterflies, So those are those little ones in the bottom. They're kind of cabbage moths is another sometimes southern iteration of a name for those. We do have some of the brushfoot butterflies, some of the skippers. Those are going to be the kind of brown ones that look more like moths, and some of the gossamer wings. But we also have monarchs, and we actually have already seen some this year. So if you have been waiting for those in your garden, keep an eye out because they are here. All of these are going to be attracted to bright flowers. They're going to be tubular, but the difference for them is that they don't have the ability that hummingbirds have where they can just kind of hover. So they're going to need a landing pad, something to actually kind of sit on. They're going to go for nectar-rich flowers, sometimes lightly scented, always aiming for those clusters. You can see that in all of the pictures with these butterflies here, is that they're actually, each of those plants has a lot of little flowers. And they're going to go for nectar guides, which we'll talk about a little bit more with our bees. But one really critical thing to know about all butterflies is that if you want them in quantity in your garden, you need to have larval host plants. And so what that means is that you need to be prepared to have things that the caterpillars can eat. If you don't have the caterpillars, you're not going to have very many of the adults. Now, granted, a couple may fly over from your very, very pollinator-friendly neighbor's garden, but you'll get a lot more if you're actually growing it. But they are voracious consumers. They're very hungry caterpillars. They have specific plants per species that they grow on. Most of our butterflies actually tend to be more specialist, meaning they like a couple of different plants instead of generalist who'll just kind of eat whatever they see. They're going to also need these to grow from larva to pupa, and so until they get in that chrysalis stage, they're going to be continuously growing, continuously eating. This can be a little bit frustrating depending on what you've got in your garden that they're eating. And so one of the big things that we recommend is to plant more, especially of kind of the herb families, the dill, bronze fennel, parsley. We can guarantee that this little friend you see up in the top corner here, this is a tiger swallowtail caterpillar. If you have those things in your yard and you have tiger swallowtail caterpillars, they're going to eat it. If you are having monarch caterpillars you're trying to raise, milkweed is their only caterpillar food, and they're going to eat it to the ground if you do not have enough, which can be frustrating if you didn't inherently plant those plants for the butterflies. So this is one of those great times when you get to say that I have authorized you and encouraged you to go back to the store and buy some more because, you know, the pollinators needed it. So what gardener doesn't like to be told that they can go get some more plants? The other big thing that we do here in the garden, in our kitchen garden, we have a lot of these crops. And so if we notice that some area that we're actually planning to use for food production is being overrun, we will actually move the caterpillars by hand. This is really satisfying too if you have kids who are able to do this gently. They are still bugs who are fairly squishy, so you gotta be careful when you pick them up. But they're really easy to move. They'll just kind of hang out and walk around, and then you can actually move them to other plants you may be happier with them eating. The other big thing to remember is that if you have caterpillars in your gardens, what you may think is a nasty little bug could end up being that butterfly that you've been waiting for 5 or 6 years. And so you may be squishing all of them in caterpillar form before they ever grow up. So there are a couple of links here, carolinanature.com, the larva of North American Lepidoptera are great online resources, and then there's tons of ID guidebooks you can choose from as well. So, bees, one of my absolute favorites for a multitude of reasons, but they really dominate the game when it comes to pollination. They can be either solitary or eusocial, meaning they live by themselves or in groups. They can be ground nesting or tree or wood dwelling. It really depends on each different species. But as a whole, they're going to be attracted to bright flowers, not really red. They can't see red. They just perceive it as a dark color. They are also going to go for tubular flowers with a landing pad. So remember, they're not hummingbirds. They want to actually be able to sit and rest while they forage. They're going to go to nectar rich because they're bringing back enough for their babies. And they tend to kind of prefer sweet or minty smelling flowers. And then this is the big thing with nectar guides. So bees actually see in UV. So this is a black-eyed Susan, and this is what you or I would see. But because bees have the ability to see in UV, this is actually what they see. So this outer ring of petals is going to be surrounded by an inner ring and then kind of a bullseye at the center. And this center bullseye is what points them towards the nectar source. Now, occasionally you can get some bees, like this little carpenter bee up top in our columbine, who actually cheats the system a bit and nectar robs. Carpenter bees are known for this. Some wasp species do this too, but they'll actually chew a little hole in the top of the flower, and then they'll end up actually sucking out the nectar from the backside. When they do that, they're not pollinating. So it's annoying behavior, but not bad. But overall, they're really going to be prioritizing when they're foraging. Bees tend to forage on either nectar, which they're bringing for carbohydrates, pollen, which they're bringing back for protein, or some amount of water or sap as they need it. The other big thing is that they have the special ability, both carpenter bees and bumblebees, which are larger, have the special ability to buzz pollinate. And because of that, it's actually the only way that some food crops are able to be pollinated. So in North Carolina, we talked about this a little bit, but this kind of gives you an idea. We have over 500 species in North Carolina alone. So more or less 17 species of bumblebees, carpenter bees, squash bees, southeastern blueberry bees, sweat bees, mining bees. We have over 100 species of, 37 species of leaf-cutting bees, 21 species of mason bees. So you can see kind of the differing sizes in this graphic here. Some of them are very, very large, and some of them are much, much smaller, but they all do a ton of work. Honeybees, as we talked about earlier, are not actually native. So if you have been under the impression that you are helping native bees when you help honeybees, not inherently, because honeybees are not native. We brought them over with us to the New World. So the biggest deal, especially when we're talking about bees, is going to be bumblebees and honeybees. And they're both particularly special because they're eusocial. So they live in groups. They're going to be working kind of towards a common goal, generally in a queen-style system with the rest of the hive providing. They're covered in all of these little plumose hairs, which you can see here. And it kind of looks like branched or feather sort of things. And then they have corbicula, or more commonly referred to as pollen baskets, where they can actually pack pollen onto these surfaces and carry it back to their colonies. From a pollination standpoint, though, honeybees win out overall because they are manageable. You can buy a box of bumblebees, but as soon as that lid comes off, there went all your bumblebees. It's kind of like the deal with ladybugs when we buy those in. And honeybees have huge hives in comparison. So an average bumblebee hive at the height of the season will have maybe 500 bumblebees. An average honeybee hive at the height of the season could have as many as 100,000 honeybees. The other big thing with honeybees is that they have flower fidelity. And what this means is that they're going to go to the same kind of flower type every time. So they don't go out to see a zinnia, a dahlia, a squash, a cucumber. They go out to see a zinnia, a zinnia, a zinnia, a zinnia, a zinnia, home. A sunflower, 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 home. And for plants, this is really, really important because it means they're getting a better kind of quality of pollen because it's not just kind of a mess of everything brought in. And this number is actually a little bit old, but just pollination. So we're not talking any honey, any products like that. We have $185 million in that value just in North Carolina. But let's be real, everybody has some issues. The number one complaint of all bees, they're gonna sting me. So, drones, the males of the group, do not sting. So a lot of times You'll see this early in the season. This really freaks people out with carpenter bees. They're huge. They are not the brightest creatures in the world necessarily, so they may fly directly into your face, but they cannot sting you. The ladies, however, are a little bit of a different story. And so one big thing to kind of think in mind is that if you leave them alone, you're not really going to get stung in general. Foraging bees do not sting unless strongly provoked. So think of this as, if I'm out, we talked about, if you're out, you're doing your own thing, people leave you alone, you're probably going to kind of leave other people alone. But if somebody comes and knocks on your front door for like 25 minutes straight, you're probably not going to be the nicest person when you open that front door. So same thing with bees. If they're in their colony or near their babies, they're going to be extremely protective. And as much as you can kind of avoid those areas as stay away from them. And one of the biggest things is just to be calm around them. I cannot tell you how many people I've seen who a bee flies near them and they fling their hands up in the air and go, "Oh my God, it's a bee!" Which is probably the fastest way to trigger a bee sting. If you see a bee around you, you just kind of keep your hands to yourself. Don't fling them up in the air like a crazy person. Walk out of the area if you're concerned. They're going to leave you alone. They have no desire to sting you unless you're attacking them. So whether that's a perceived attack or a for real attack, they're not going to try and do that unless that's what they're getting. And a big thing to note is that most people are truly not allergic to bees. This is actually my arm after I had been in a honeybee hive here at the palace, and I was not being particularly careful, and so my gloves got a little pulled down. I got stung 3 times while I was in their hive, and this is what my hive stings look like. So a lot of people will say, well, I got stung by a bee one time, and I swole up completely. And I will tell you, I have been stung a couple of times when I was messing with them in my bee suit, in the bee hive, and I walked away, and they stung me in the face, and I looked like Cindy Lou Who for 2 days, but that's not actually a true allergic reaction. So when we define a true allergic reaction, that's that you're having anaphylactic swelling. More or less, as you can see in this picture, this is basically what happens to most people who are more sensitive towards even fire ants or mosquitoes. So you may swell up a little bit. This does not mean that you're gonna immediately go into anaphylactic shock or anything like that. So, the ones you love to hate. I cannot tell you how much time I spend with people complaining about carpenter bees. And I am probably the worst person to complain to carpenter bees about because I adore them. I think they're super cute, I think they're really funny, and they're really good pollinators. They are native. They do have fairly annoying home building habits. So this is actually a fence in our yard from 1 year to 3 years later, where they actually have initially drilled 2 holes on the post. You can see up here, here, and here. And then as time goes on, this post has actually been degraded because what they're doing, the females are laying eggs, and so they lay them in little cocoons the entire way down. However, I leave this post alone. They only really drill in that one post. I keep my husband away from seeing it, and we all live happily ever after. Because carpenter bees do tend to go back to the same location that they were born in over time. So if you have an issue, it's going to continue to stay kind of localized to where that was previously. Another big reason, though, with carpenter bees that we really kind of need to watch it is that most of the bees that you may have heard about either becoming endangered or extinct are, sorry, I'm losing my mind, are bumblebees. And so bumblebees and carpenter bees are both really special for their ability to buzz pollinate. And so that buzz pollination in particular is going to be very specified to tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, potentially potatoes, and things like that. So if you like eating those, honeybees cannot pollinate those crops whatsoever. So if we lose all of our bumblebee pollination, the only pollinators who are really going to be able to do a consistent job on those food groups that we rely very heavily on are going to be carpenter bees and whatever leftover bumblebees we have. So how do you fix it? More or less, if it's not in a bad kind of really front of your house area, just try to kind of get over it. Leave it alone. If you have old wooden posts that they can bore into, that you can leave further out in the yard and discourage them from other areas, that tends to help. Make sure you're accurately IDing. So in these photos, a lot of people would potentially say that these look like bumblebees, but these are actually all carpenter bees. So if you're just going out and swatting things that you think are carpenter bees on flowers, you may be potentially helping cause endangered bumblebees. So if you're not 100% sure, do not go bother killing things that you don't know about, which is a generally good rule in the garden. And then replace old wood. So what we end up doing with posts like this is you swap it out because it doesn't have that familiar kind of scent of home, for lack of a better term. They're actually not going to go towards it. So you'll see a lot of people who end up replacing decks or things like that don't have that same behavior on the deck the next year. It's not a cheap option, but if you're really concerned about certain areas, you can do this to combat that. And be really careful spraying anything. Anything you're going to spray that'll kill a carpenter bee will probably kill every other form of bee and probably most of our other pollinators. So really be really cautious anytime you're going to use any chemical, but especially if you think you're going to spray something that's going to magically kill a carpenter bee, assume that you're killing the rest of the pollinators in your yard too. The other big thing that comes up these days is that honeybees, because they are not native, actually can be a competition with native pollinators for resources. And so they do have some swarming tendencies that tend to freak people out. So they'll do a kind of giant tornado cluster ball, and then they go up in a tree and make a new home. So when honeybees do this, they're actually replicating the colony. This is how the colony as a whole divides, and they'll end up actually making new homes out of this. In both of these cases, plant more so that you don't have native pollinator people who are causing an issue, and then make sure that you've got plenty of forage. A variety of plants and bloom times are going to help with that, and so you really want to be careful that you're kind of spacing it out. We talked about this a little bit in our Hawk Salé video that you can find on our Facebook as well. So really think about what plants you're adding into your gardens. And then as far as swarms go, in North Carolina, we actually have the largest national organization of beekeepers. And so I think almost every county in North Carolina has at least one beekeeper club that serves them directly. Here locally, that would be Craven Pamlico Beekeeper Club. And so if you ever see this kind of weird, creepy swarm thing, just call up your local ag extension or find your local beekeeper's website, and they generally have people who are more than happy to come out and help you out and get those swarms moved away. So, first cousins once removed. I am a big fan of these, and this freaks a lot of people out that I have even considered to talk about them. But wasps are really, really great pollinators. And honestly, if you are tolerating or encouraging butterflies in your garden, you should be encouraging wasps, because wasps are much better pollinators than butterflies are for 90% of plants. We've got a lot of different types of them. So up in this top corner, this is a mud dauber wasp, and then we have two different styles of paper wasp. This is kind of the all brown form or the yellow and brown striped form, and then cicada killers. And so those three are really the only ones I'm going to talk about. We do have yellow jackets, bald-faced hornets, and European hornets here in North Carolina as well, but they're all kind of jerks, and so I'm not going to bother trying to convince you that you should keep your gardens in nice places for them, but be careful of the others. Wasps are generally going to be solitary or eusocial, and then ground nesting or tree or wood dwelling, very similar to how bees live. They also are going to be attracted to nectar and pollen-rich flowers, and generally more single flowers. than many of our others. So, unfortunately, wasps have the unique ability to sting repeatedly and angrily, and they build their nest in inconvenient places. And so these two factors can really lead to some great strife between us and wasps. In general, leave them alone if you can. If they're really going to be somewhere that's inconvenient, try to get rid of the nest early. The bigger their nest is, the more babies they're actually raising in it. And same as bees, they do not want you messing with their babies. Try to be calm around them as much as possible. This is very much the same as bees. If you do the flinging hands in the air and screaming thing, you are much more likely to get stung. And accurately identify them. Most wasps are actually going to be good. They're parasitic to garden pests, so they'll actually help deal with some of those nasty bugs. A lot of them actually eat spiders, including black widows, and since black widows are definitely not going to be a useful pollinator friend to you, you want to leave some people in the garden who are going to be pollinating friends and will also take out some of your nastier enemies you may not even be seeing. So then, be careful about spraying anything. These three in the bottom here, the European hornet, the bald-faced hornet, and the Asian giant hornet, they are all kind of the jerks of the group. But you can see that they look fairly similar to these two up top, which are both actually paper wasp species. So paper wasps are generally going to be really calm, cool, collected. They're actually one of the easiest pollinators in the garden that you can go up to and watch foraging if you can find them. But the others, all of the hornets, tend to have some issues. They're not nice. They will sting you because it makes them happy. I mean, it's a bit of a dramatization, but they're not lovely creatures that we enjoy. So try to be careful if you're going to spray anything for those particular species, because it will damage many of the other species we're trying to keep. And then our ugly ducklings. So some of the most common examples of flies in North Carolina are these syrphid or flower flies, which are going to be kind of these ones that you see on the smaller side here. But you see we actually do have, these are called bee or drone flies because they look so similar. They look very, very hairy. And then even your house flies are going to be potentially pollinators. They're going to almost always be attracted to this kind of pale or dark red or brown flowers. So this up here is actually a pawpaw bloom. They forage on those. They also will be very much focused on nectar and pollen rich. They like stinky flowers. Of course, that kind of makes sense. And they like funnel-shaped flowers. So they're very good at figuring out traps. They're actually pretty intelligent. And so when flowers have very specific pollination techniques set up for that, they tend to be better than most of our other pollinators at figuring out how to work. So if you can, they're annoying, and they can lay eggs and spread diseases. But in general, if you can let them outside and leave them alone, you're going to have a much easier time of it. They can't sting you, and the syrphid fly larvae, which is pictured here, actually eats aphids. So if you are doing any level of gardening, especially vegetable gardening, you probably want to leave them alone because they eat aphids way faster than most ladybugs do. And plant the stinky flowers that they may be attracted to in areas away from where you hang out. That way you're not going to have as many issues. I will also say in this bottom picture, these are actually cacao blooms, so this is what chocolate comes from, and the only pollinator for chocolate is a fly. And make sure you're accurately IDing them. So we talked about this a little bit on Tuesday too, but all of the flies actually have one pair of wings, but this up here is actually a fly. It is not a bee. So it can be really, really hard to recognize, and you don't want to just be swatting bees because you thought you saw a fly. So to tie it all together, be calm as much as possible. Try to accurately ID it and log it. The more you know what lives in your garden, the easier time you're going to have kind of recognizing them. Make sure you're using integrated pest management, meaning that you don't always go all the way up to the nastiest form of chemical you can find. Try to leave spaces for nesting behaviors or create those spaces if you don't already have them. And be really critical of your references. Remember that pest removal services are a business. They make money off of coming to you and charging you money to do things. So of course they're going to tell you that the worst thing in your life is a carpenter bee, because they would like you to pay them a fair amount of money to come solve that problem for you that may not actually be a problem. You also want to make sure that you have long blooming and overlapping bloom times. This will get you to see a lot more variety in your pollinators, and it will make your garden a more enjoyable place to be. And just as a general thing, remember that caring for pollinators means that you're caring for all pollinators. So it's great that monarchs are super, the rage right now. It's great that honeybees got a lot of people who care about them. But if you're not doing things across the whole of your gardening life and your life in general, that you're probably not actually helping pollinators all that much. So, some useful resources. I'm going to leave this up as I answer some questions so that you can take a screenshot or just pause it to see. But there are a lot of really great ones. Our museum store actually has the 100 Plants to Feed the Bees by the Xerxes Society, which is a really helpful one. It ID keys out many, many things. And so these can all be really great ways to kind of figure out. I will also say, even though we are getting towards the end of it, it is the end of our Pollinator Week members only plant sale today, and that we'll be taking orders till 5 p.m. today. So if you have not already seen that on our Facebook page, make sure you check that out. So without further ado, I've got some questions here that I'm going to go through and read, and we will see what we've got next. All right. Yes, we've got somebody saying, bees are my friends, can't make mead without them. That's a very good point. Most of the food, but also some of our beverages come from them. As far as whether a bee is native or not, why that kind of matters, it's a big deal you'll see in some groups. So this happens a lot too in our native plant groups, where you'll have some people who don't want to talk about it unless it's a native. I personally don't ascribe to that theory. I think there are lots of things that we have that have been introduced that are really great plants and really great animals. But it does mean that you just want to keep that in mind, because if you are only advocating for honeybees, you may not actually, people may not hear you as widely as if you were advocating for all bees. And so with a lot of our native bees, they may be the only source of pollination for some of our native crops. So like squash bees are really impeccably a better pollinator of our native, of our squash plants commercially than honeybees are. We can use honeybees, but they're kind of like, honeybees don't love squash to the same extent. So that's kind of why we end up with that. But if there aren't any other questions, feel free to continue dropping them throughout the day. I'll try and keep checking in on that. And we hope you have a wonderful National Pollinator Week and get out there and see some of the potential buggies in your yard before it rains again, which hopefully it will not do anytime soon. Thank y'all, and y'all have a great rest of your day. We appreciate you tuning in.